I think that's time to start. Welcome to the special lecture by our colleague Anne Bordeleau. Tonight she's talking about this book, Charles Robert Cockerell, Architect in Time. And in order to prepare for this talk, I reread the book, not the whole book, but you read the beginning and the end and some little bits in between, and I really had developed a nice speech. I thought actually it was an excellent speech, which focused on the end, and then I saw Anne a couple of hours ago. She said that was going to be her lecture. So I was forced to go back to the beginning. So let me read to you the first sentence of the book itself. The Professor's Dream, Cockerell's best-known drawing, Plate 1, captures Cockerell's fundamental views on architecture in time. And then she goes on with describing the painting. And then we go to the second paragraph. And then the author, Anne Bordeleau, says it was the most widely reproduced drawing. Even those who know little about its creator will likely have encountered it, especially as the drawing has experienced a revival in the last decades. The ascent of postmodernism that movement's foundations in historicism inspired the use of the Professor's Dream as a poster for the 1980 Venice Biennale. Over a decade later, the drawing featured on the cover of the book Architecture in the Age of Historicism. But was Cockerell's dream truly that of a historicist? Now, you probably didn't get it, but that's a straight criticism of the author of that book, Architectural Principles in the Age of Historicism, myself. So I actually got tenure in this university on the basis of a book which this author of this book basically defines in the second paragraph to be a totally wrong, erroneous interpretation. So what to say about a professor's dream? Good luck. So I think actually that we see here a little bit of the professor's dream, of the drawing of it. And I think actually that maybe Anne Bordeleau was not fundamentally misguided in her second paragraph. I mean, she was misguided, but not fundamentally. We can argue about if my interpretation is more valid than her interpretation. But I think that Cockerell was really misguided. To call a drawing which shows the great monuments of architecture a professor's dream. Because let's be honest, a professor's dream is not about buildings. It's about the students you teach, and it's about the colleagues you have. And so I prefer not to look at this thing and call it a professor's dream, but I would like to look at this thing and call it a professor's dream. And in this dream, of course, I can in some way make comparisons between some of those buildings and some of my students and some of my colleagues. I will not try to make particular identifications here, but of course this one stands out. It's a column, and on the column is liberty. And liberty represents, of course, freedom to think, freedom of action, freedom of being who you are and who you want to be. And I must say that I remember the first time that Anne was in this room. Now, was it 6 years ago? 7 years ago? 7 years ago. She came for an interview and a search in which I was involved. And I think it is the first and last time that I saw a candidate present, and literally by the time she had stopped, I knew that she would be an absolutely perfect fit, at least for my dream. There was only one reason for it, really, and that is that she had promised to talk for an hour, and she talked for exactly an hour. I was timing it, which in this school is very unusual. So, in any case, there was this beautiful moment at the end of the lecture. Everything was very well prepared, beautiful slide presentation. I mean, everything was just perfect. And then the questions came. And the moment that the question came, she pulled out that blackboard and she started drawing her argument. And I thought, really, that is fantastic. We have actually an architecture professor who doesn't only dream, but actually draws. And so I'm very curious what's going to happen tonight. But I must say that these 7 years have been fantastic. I'm very proud to be your colleague. I think that you have literally enriched the program in every part of the program. I mean, I don't know to what extent technology. I will leave that to Terry, but certainly I will have assisted you in studio. I'll be your colleague in ICO, and I must say this has been a great ride, and you are my dream. So.
Tough act to follow, but thank you for the kind words. I'll try to speak for only an hour, precisely an hour. And good evening. Thank you. First, thank you to the School of Architecture for inviting me and offering me this opportunity to present the book. Thank you all, of course, for coming. It feels good to be back home. Actually, I was just at University Laval at the School of Architecture there last Thursday, presenting the book. And I think I must have spent at least a third of the time that I was allocated just trying to explain why it was that as an architect and professor of architecture, I thought it was important to study history. Describing then why, while I was not really a historian or actually resisted being called one, why I still thought that it was fundamental to study history. But of course, your Waterloo students, colleagues, community, family, and if I may be allowed such a French reference, just like Obelix, you've been thoroughly bathed in the potion of history. So I do not need to spend 20 minutes justifying why it is important to study history. And yet, I have to say that when I was looking at the Winter Series lecture poster, I did feel a bit anachronistic. It's a great group of speakers, and I could not fail to notice that, of course, everyone is really actively involved in contemporary practice, looking at projects that range from installations to landscape projects, looking at computer science, digital fabrication, and then Cockerel. Cockerel, yes, 19th-century British architect. No, really, you should hear it is relevant. So if I were a real historian, maybe a historian that writes for other historians, even though that's not really true, but I'm just trying to make a point. Well, if I were a real historian, maybe I would not worry about the situation. But since I still define myself as an architect, since I've practiced and I hope to somehow get back into it one day, I don't know how, and since my interest in the past is in no way to flee from the present or to find a temporary shelter away from the busyness of our times, I still feel I ought to explain at least a little my decision to work on Cockerel, on 19th-century British architecture, on history. And this is the point at which I call the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben to my rescue. And you've probably seen that quote before. But according to Agamben, we can only see our times if we take a distance from it. We can only see our time if we are out of phase with it. Indeed, if we stay in sync with our time, we are so identified with it that we cannot, in fact, see it. So in what is contemporaneity, Agamben writes, contemporariness, then, is a singular relationship with one's own time, which adheres to it and, at the same time, keeps a distance from it. More precisely, it is that relationship with time that adheres through it through a disjunction and an anachronism. Those who coincide too well with the epoch, those who are perfectly tied to it in every respect, are not contemporaries, precisely because they do not manage to see it. They are not able to firmly hold their gaze on it. So history is one path to this type of contemporaneity, and fundamentally, I am interested in the past so that I can maybe get a better grasp on the present. So it is good to be home, but it's also a bit strange to lecture at one's own school. And as Robert Jan was saying, the last and I guess only time when I did this was when I came for an interview here in 2007. And I guess it was all very positive. I got the position, but it came with these instructions: must be willing to teach medieval cultural history. Well, I was willing. I'm always pretty much willing to dive into something else. But of course, this was something new. As you will hear tonight, my doctoral research, which I completed in 2006, was on the 19th century architect's conception of time and history. So not exactly medieval. 7 years down the road, though, I have to admit that I've learned a tremendous amount for having had to teach 6 hours of medieval culture a week, and I hope the students have too. And I'm not really just referring to being able to identify the different parts of a church or a monastic compound, but I think as importantly, if not more importantly, it's to be able to delve into issues with a larger perspective, but notions of imitation, innovation, or cartography, or even actually understanding the philosopher Walter Benjamin much better than I ever did before because I looked at the Middle Ages, believe me. So it is also to prepare some of my classes on medieval culture that I came across another wonderful book by Giorgio Agamben. The title of that book is The Time That Remains, a commentary of the Epistle to the Romans. So for those not versed in the Bible, the epistle, or this letter, is one of the books in the New Testament in which the Apostle Paul talks about the gospel, the good news, in relation to the possibility of salvation. So don't worry, I'm not about to talk about the Bible, nor about Paul, though I may talk a little bit about salvation by history. But this book by Agamben emerged out of his series of seminars that he conducted in France, Italy, and the United States in 1998, 1999. So the book is wonderful, rich, insightful, but the only reason, or the main reason why I'm bringing it up tonight is because of the way in which it is structured. So through each series of seminars, Agamben used the same approach, to perform the exegesis, so that is to perform the very close interpretation of the epistle. He chose to read only the first verse, translating it word by word, commenting it word by word. So his idea was to treat the first verse as though it recapitulated, in the 10 words that composed it, the message of the text in its entirety. In short, he says he offered a commentary to the letter, as well as in every direction of the 10 words of the first verse. So I wonder if you know where I'm going with this. I thought I could adopt a similar approach this evening. I decided that I would likewise recapitulate my book on Cockerel through a multifaceted commentary of the words that compose its title. Well, I also thought maybe it's a bit silly, but then when I realized that my title had 10 words, then it was too late, I had to do it. So Agamben's seminar unfolded over 7 days, and he spent the first 6 days looking at every word one by one, and he spent the last day, the 7th, recapitulating it. So I do not like him have 6+1 days, but I followed his 6+1 organization, and I will therefore present 6 sections with a 7th recapitulating them, and in short, my talk tonight will follow this order. So 1, Charles Robert Cockerell; 2, Architect in Time; 3, Reflections; 4, Around; 5, Anachronistic; 6, Drawings; 7, Charles Robert Cockerell, Architect in Time, Reflections around Anachronistic Drawings. So, without further ado, Charles Robert Cockerell. This part of the title might lead one to believe that the book is a biography. There is a biography that exists on Cockerell. It was written in 1970 by the architectural historian David Watkin. Watkin's title is The Life and Works of Charles Robert Cockerell. So in Watkin's book, you will learn that Cockerell was born in 1788. He was the son of an architect. He aspired to perhaps be a painter, but followed his father's footsteps. You will learn that after he apprenticed for 5 years with his father, he worked with Robert Smirke, who is the architect of the British Museum, amongst other buildings. And then he embarked at the age of 22 in 1810 on a grand tour. So the grand tour is this tradition that's already about 100 years old, where architects, artists, writers go and travel for extended period of time through the sites, and mainly for the architects, the sites to visit the masterpieces of the Renaissance architecture, but also going to the sites of antiquity, so go to see the ruins in Greece, Turkey, and North Africa. So it's an opportunity to complete one's education, but also to make acquaintances of like-minded travelers or locals. So you will learn in that Watkins' book that, for example, he met Ingres and others on the tour, and then that the painter Ingres drew his portrait in 1817 while they were both in Rome. That he acquired quite a bit of fame by participating in two very important excavations, one of the temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassa and the temple of Jupiter Pan-Enalius at Aegina. Also, that he acquired quite a bit of respect by being able to propose quite impressive reconstructions. So working from the fragments scattered on site, being able to imagine or actually collect these fragments to propose what could be assembled from here. Here it's a giant anthropomorphic order at the Temple of Giants in Agrigento. He was also the first to measure antithesis on a Greek building, the Parthenon of all buildings. So after he returned in 1817, very early on, because he acquired quite a good reputation while abroad, he was named to important positions. So architect of the Bank of England, a great patron. Surveyor of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the most important buildings in London. Also, in the 1840s, he was named Professor of Architecture at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, a position which he held for 15 years. So his most prolific years were in between 1835, 1850, 55, where he built bank branches, but also public buildings, museums, libraries. He also worked on residences. He was the first to win the gold medal from what was then the Institute of British Architects. So he won the gold medal in 1848. It's essentially the same medal that the RIB, or Royal Institute of British Architects, gives out today every year. So, and he acted also as president years later. Finally, you would learn in Watkins' book that he published on Greek, medieval, as well as Renaissance architects and architecture, but that he remained faithful to the principles as expressed in the Grecian style in a time of great relativity. And finally, that he died in 1863 and is immortalized on the Albert Memorial, third from the right here, in Kensington Park in London. So that is a biography. My book is not. Why? Well, even as I try to actually just trace his life along a chronological line, the term that comes to my mind is necrology rather than biography. I feel like I'm pointing at facts regarding something or someone dead, but I'm interested in what makes this still alive. I'm interested in what persists in the points of contact. So not that all biographies need to sound like necrologies, or that all necrology are necessarily like monuments that would take the place of the need to truly remember or bringing back to life. In fact, actually, I can think of some biographical works that are very much alive. I can think of at least, three quite different works that have that quality. The Russian director, Andrei Tarkovsky's somewhat autobiographical filmic essay of the 14th century icon painter Andrei Rublev, or Limonov, the French author Emmanuel Carrère's book on contemporary Russian writer and political dissident Limonov, and Imre Kertész, the Hungarian author, survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, in conversation with himself as the interviewer and interviewee in Dossier K, a memoir. So in Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky finds points of contact across time in how the work of an artist, whether in the 14th century or the 20th century, is very much shaped by the context in which he is operating. He presents the life of Rublev through a series of short stories that are not concerned about chronology. They look at moments, so more concerns about the kairos rather than the chronos. Similarly, in my books, 6 drawings structure a series of 6 reflections on Cockerel, and I really move back and forth in time. In Limonov, Carrère thinks that the figure of Limonov can become a window to much of post-Second World War Russia. But what is also interesting in this book that actually Carrère presents as a fiction, even though it's really much more like a biography, is that the book is punctuated with his own, Carrère's own encounter with Limonov in the course of his life. And in Dossier K, Kertész, who actually once described how he needs to claim his life back from history, and Kertész, who wrote many works that seem to be autobiographical, is often asked how much of that is based on his life. And here is trying to set the record straight, or not, between what is fiction and what is fact. or what is life. This distinction also marks historical writings. Even though historiography is based on facts, the way in which these facts are narrated, the specific questions that arise out of the present in which we stand as we uncover these facts, these certainly play a role in the kind of history that is written. So I encountered Cockerell as I was looking for explicit expressions of conceptions of time and history. So this is not the life and work of Charles Robert Cockerell. It is Charles Robert Cockerell, architect in time. Charles Robert Cockerell, this name, this person, this life, and the work truly come to life with the attribute architect in time. So architect in time, this predicate is the real subject of the book. I am interested in Cockerell insofar as he aspired to be an architect in time. Architect in time should probably be seen in contrast to architect at one time, defying the trends, the forces, and the exigencies of a single time, his 19th century. There is another quote that I find quite beautiful and I often refer to. It is by the Russian author Boris Pasternak, who is addressing himself to the artist in each one of us. And he writes, keep awake, artist. Do not give in to sleep. You are eternity's hostage and prisoner of time. Cockerell's prison was the 19th century. In 3 words, the 19th century was the century of history. And Robert Jahn said the beginning of the age of historicism, and actually he co-authored this book that he mentioned about this and made fun of me because I criticized it a little. This notion that the drawing speaks of historicism. What I thought was fascinating is that it had a drawing by Cockerell on the cover, and that was before he knew me. And then this is why also I selected a preparatory study for that drawing on my book cover. So it's the same drawing, but an earlier version. So with respect to architecture, historicism, this presence of history, this 19th century obsession with history really is visible in different ways. It's visible in the embrace of a certain relativity of style. So I'm trying to just describe this 19th century context here. So for example, here, one historical dress could fit as well as another on this plan. So this is a drawing by Joseph Michael Gandy, who was the draftsman of Sir John Soane, the architect, saying there can be one plan and you pick your dress, it doesn't matter, one or the other. Or it could emerge in the strict choice of one historical style over another. And the 19th century, in that period, particularly after the fire of the Parliament, and where they had to think of what was going to be the new House of Parliament, what was the style, there's this battle, the battle of the styles that emerged, where people were trying to push one style or another, but also saying maybe it was better to represent it, for example, as Augustus Pugin would say, with the Gothic style, because that was associated with morality, and therefore somehow the style came with its meaning. It communicated something that could then be representative of England at this time. The question of history also emerged in the form of looking for a style that was not just selected out of existing styles in history, but actually trying to find a style that would really define 19th century architecture. Why did they need to copy? Couldn't they just build in a way that would reflect the changes, the Industrial Revolution, the new methods of construction, the new materials? And this is a drawing that's somewhat emblematic of this, Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace for the 1851 World Exhibit that was held in London. So using cast iron, but also standardized pieces, a new technology for glass, and all of this in a building that projected the country in a way that I was actually only used typically either for greenhouses or more functional building. So Cockerell stands out. He was faithful to the Grecian model because he considered that they best applied principles that he considered to be universal. But he was publishing, as we said, on architecture of all times, and he aspired to be an architect in time. So Cockerell stands out as someone who attempts to operate beyond historicist categorizations, that's someone who tries to resist the strict linking of a style to a specific period. The particularity of this part of the title, Architect in Time, is that it is actually a quote. In the midst of his career, in the 1840s, as he was busy working on various projects, as he was occupied at least half the year with the preparation of Royal Academy lectures, lectures which he insisted on altering year after year, and for which he did an incredible amount of research, also an incredible amount of drawings, actually including comparative church, but also, this drawing that we've talked about, the Professor's Dream, this is a 6 feet wide by 5 feet tall drawing that assembles over 100 buildings, and that was exhibited in the Royal Academy of Arts in 1848 in the annual exhibition. And I'll come back to the drawing in a moment, but for now, I think what's important to note that these are his most busy years. He has no time to waste or spare between his practice, his teaching, and yet he prepares this drawing, an extraordinary presentation of his conception of history. So, precisely at that time then, at the busiest time of his professional life as an architect, professor, and historian, he shared with his faithful assistant the following sentiment. I tell you what, John, you and I ought to be architects in time. We should never have known so much about architecture, but for the work upon these lectures. The title thus contains a quote. A quote, according to Walter Benjamin, calls the word by its name, takes it away from its context, which it destroys. In many ways, the calling forth of the name architect in time does give the person Charles Robert Cockerell a new vocation. We could consider the book as the action of restoring the context of these words, not only to that one occasion in the years between 1840 and 1850, when he's confided to his faithful assistant, John Eastley Goodchild, that they ought to have been architects in time, but somewhat fictively and somewhat factually. Based on this quote, the book calls Cockerell to new life and vocation, a more important one as well as possibly a more humble one, that of being architect in time. So what I mean to say is that the book not only tries to explain what Cockerell might have specifically meant in that one occasion, but more generally what this could have meant for him in the context, in his life as a whole. Cockerell understood well the kind of humility that was required, or perhaps more accurately the adjustment of ambition that the wish to be architect in time implied. In his inaugural lecture at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1842, he quoted the German poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller to suggest to his own students that they should forego the pursuit of fame and recognition in their own time. So Schiller says, the artist is the son of his time, happy for him if he's not its pupil, still happier if he's not its favorite. Reflections. The French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty says the following on reflection. For the act of reflection to substantiate itself as a reflection, that is, as progress towards truth, it cannot limit itself to the replacement of a worldview by another. It must show us how the naive view is comprehended and surpassed by the reflected view. So here's the challenge, and to a certain extent, this was Cockerell's challenge as much as it is mine, to convey that the consideration of a very broad spectrum of time and history both contains and moves beyond the consideration of our own time. Things change so quickly today that we can hardly keep up with our own time. So how is it that we can justify reflecting on the past as a reflection, in Merleau-Ponty's sense, as something that actually contains the present worldview and moves beyond it? We sometimes tend to consider that the opposite is more accurate. Typically, the new, the latest, is not simply innovative, it is better, it is progressive. It is the present that is seen as something that supersedes the past and encompasses it, not the opposite. The task of the book then becomes the consideration of how, for Cockerell, the aspiration of being architect in time surpassed the ambition to be architect of his time. I might add that in the shadow of that task lies also the challenge of articulating why the consideration of Cockerell, of 19th century architecture specifically, and of the history of architecture's relation to time more generally, then how that may in turn contain our own present concerns, that is, bring us beyond the prison that our own time might constitute with its dominating trends and forces. For Cockerell, the possibility to move beyond the either-or of one worldview versus another is played out in the rich interplay between the now and then. So this is expressed most powerfully in his grasp of the fragment, as well as his indexical use of ornaments. Cockerell talks about the fragments around an unfinished sculpture by Michelangelo. He describes two strands. First, that the observer can admire the work of the sculptor, here Michelangelo, who literally gives birth to the form that he is skilled enough to find, as though it pre-existed in the stone. But also another great character of incomplete works of fragments was how they involved or needed their observers to be completed. The observers were called upon to animate what was left unfinished. They were actively involved in completing the work with their imagination. We can also see this at work in some of Cockerell's drawings. This drawing is of St. George's Hall, Liverpool. This was a project that Cockerell had to take over after the original architect, Harvey Lonsdale Elms, died prematurely. So in 1851, he receives drawings by Elms, but also a shelf is already completed. There are fragments there that he must work from to project the rest of the building. And the approach that he adopts to project into the future is very close to the approach that he adopted when he visited sites of antiquity and worked from the fragments to project back in time. So on the left, we have the Ulpian Basilica that he reconstructed from the fragments that he found in Trajan's Forum in Rome. And in both cases, you have fragments in the foreground, the building that is slowly being reconstructed with scaffolds in the middle ground, and in the background, the completed construction projected forward or backward in time with crowds ambiguously positioned in these times, belonging neither here nor there, neither now nor then. In this project, in this drawing of Cambridge University Library, what's interesting is that it's not so much that he was working from a fragment, but actually that the outcome was a fragment. So this project, this is what I forgot to ask, a pointer. But you see, this is in the key plan here. That was the whole quadrangle as projected. So if you think of the typical Cambridge or Oxford College, 4 wings, a courtyard, and this was what was meant to occupy this site. But I think what's interesting here is that at one point, it seems as though Cockerell accepted that this was only going to be a fragment, and that as a fragment, it didn't point to one single whole, but actually there are many potential ways in which we can complete this. And between the key plan, what's represented in perspective, but also some of the projects that Cockerell recovered from other architects that worked on the site before, or what the site was then when he built, or what it is today, indeed, this fragment can start to belong to a number of different wholes that also then point to a number of different times. When discussing ornaments, Cockerell also considered how they could come alive. That is, how they could arrest the eyes, move forward, recede. For example, he was fascinated with this capital on the right, the Bassa capital, because he understood how it must have animated the space in which it was located. So that's the capital that he found in the temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassa. 10-second course on this capital. Typically, on the left, it's played by Julien David Leroy. The volutes would be aligned to the wall, sort of parallel to the wall against which they would be lined up. Whereas in the Bassa type, they're angled. So it's more dynamic. It can indeed arrest the eyes. And in the way that Cockerell uses these capitals, I think what's interesting is that, he takes advantage of their dynamism and the way that they can come alive. But I think it's also that he cites them in a way that reminds us of this idea of the quote. He cites them and in some ways destroy the original context from which they came from. It's not about being able to identify where this came from, that it's actually taken from some temple in Bassa. But it's about their life here. It's about the fact that, for example, in the Ashmolean Museum and Taylorian Institute in Oxford, we can look at the Bassa capital from the outside, but inside they come back and look at us. Or at Cambridge University Library, that we can stand and admire it at a distance, or here and now we can touch it. So, through his conceptions of the fragments and of ornaments, Cockerell is constructing hinges. Hinges that enable not only the participation in different times, both historical and experiential, but also the intersection of the factual and the imagined, between what is given and how it might be experienced. So does Cockerell view then move beyond the naive view, the view of our present, of a single time oriented towards the future? We can debate this, of course. But the fact that he understands his own contribution as but a fragment, the fact that he understands his own contribution as one that will be made and remade in the invisible space of experience and in a context that extends both spatially and temporally. Though this may point to a condition that in fact defines any kind of architectural intervention, it nevertheless expresses a level of humility or even lucidity that sounds more admirable than deplorable. In the end, rather than focusing on one time or another, he is interested in those hinges, fragments, ornaments, hinges that can operate in a larger sea of time. The context, or we might say what is around, is always present, participating in what is being communicated. Around. This word carries connotations to a work in its context, but also to how one may approach it. With respect to the approach, my decision to reflect around rather than to reflect on suggests that this reflection is not written as a thought process that would dominate the topic, be on it in order to cover it. The reflection does not take form over Cockerell's work, but by thinking in the space that his work established, just as one might find it best to work in some corner of the library or by a window. With respect to the context, around is what frames the work, what borders it, what is near it. So, for example, let's go back to the professor's dream to reflect around it. We can situate this dream within a series or tradition of comparative drawings, so French, German, English collection, English architects, theoreticians, historians that collect buildings and styles either to order, to compare, to show progression, to categorize, or simply to present the history of architecture in the space of a single drawing. I'm only showing these four. I've looked at many more. And in looking around, it enabled me to identify one particularity that is unique to Cockerell's drawing. The fact that it's not placed on a single ground line, but that there are actually four platforms. And these are written here. So there's the Egyptian platform, the Greek level where all Greek constructions are placed, the Roman platform where all Roman buildings stand, and finally the medieval and modern platform. So we can look around to try and figure out some kind of, potential influences for this stratification. And we can look here to find the most probable in recent advances in geology. The realization that the Earth was not made once and for all, but underwent constant transformation through processes of sedimentation, and we could find this in the strata of the Earth. So this was represented in the first stratigraphic maps. This is a map drawn by William Smith in 1815. And here the legend indicates the composition of the strata, like the lines on the board of the dream indicate the composition of the layers. Both legends are also temporal because the deepest, the hardest strata also tended to be the oldest ones. So this apparent influence then might be confirmed by the fact that Cockerell's interest, like many architects at the time, was not limited to his own discipline. He was in conversation with linguists, poets, painters, mathematicians, polymaths, and geologists. In fact, he writes of a visit to George Bella Greenough, another geographer, who had shared his thoughts with him on recent advances in the field. And he actually was also working on a stratigraphic map at the time, so good Greenough was. As we are in the world of geographers, then we can also look around and flip through the atlases and find this representation. In this case, challenging spatial boundaries to create this impossible tableau as a landscape that one could experience, walk through, but it's a tableau made of all the highest mountains of the world, so that we can maybe compare them, but also possibly experience them. So not unlike what Cockerell does when he defies spatial boundaries in the dream, but also temporal boundaries to bring all of these buildings from different times and different places to build a kind of impossible city that we must also explore. Or we can relate the dream or look around to look at the development of the panorama. And here, there's a note, actually. Remember Goodchild, the faithful assistant? He left a note as to the preparation of the professor's dream, and he says that they employed a kind of semi-perspective. I mean, he talks about the 4 platforms, but he also said that he employed a sort of semi-perspective, which is why it seems like maybe there's something about the panorama that is also relevant when we look at the professor's dream. One of the first images by Hector Benedict de Saussure, it was also on top of a mountain, of the Mount de Buet in 1779, trying to convey the experience one might have standing on top of that mountain. So it's not about a single viewpoint. It's really about moving and feeling this whole landscape unfolding around him. Similarly, Robert Barker's first panorama in 1792 of London, or here just showing the purpose-built construction that was in Leicester Square in London, where many kind of panoramas were shown, were either landscapes or historical scenes, but also and cities from the antiquity. And I know that Cockerell went and visited the panorama of Pompeii in 1824, and he actually dreamt about being able to present the fragments that he uncovered during his grand tour in a way that he could convey the experience, that people would walk around it and experience them. So the drawing can thus be situated within, yes, Cockerell's life and his own concerns, but also related to other concerns by other people around him, in short, to the era within which these concerns took form. So the around points to the understanding of the context. We could also say the episteme, or as Michel Foucault would say, the totality of discourse on knowledge. That is, what can be known, how is it sought, how might one get to know it? Or in simpler words, this episteme is the backdrop against which architecture is conceived. And this backdrop might change, and it does change. So if the professor's dream and the other works that we gathered around it represent 19th century conceptions of history, it is true that other understanding dominated at other times. So, for example, the episteme of the Middle Ages, and in particular this Judeo-Christian conception of time, is reflected in their map of the world. The map here is the Hereford map of 1295, so at the turn of the 13th century. And I could talk for hours about the map, and I do in my classes. But here, I'm just going to say one thing, is how it puts into relation the world of these sort of mortal sinners in relation to a God that may grant salvation. And this circle, which reflects to the parting of the waters, so the creation of the world, is not so much a geographical boundary, it's actually a temporal boundary. Inside it, there is time. Outside, there is out of time. Inside, mortality, sinners. Outside, God, possibility of salvation. Or we can move closer to our time and try to illustrate what defines our modernity, the sense of accelerated time. So this chart actually dates back to 1895, although it's been updated all the way through the 20th century. And I chose it as a picture to represent this acceleration of time, and I'll tell you why in a moment, but it's called the Synchronological Chart of Universal History. It goes all the way back to minus 4004. The two spreads that I'm showing, one is, well, minus 4004 is Adam and Eve. The two spreads I'm showing, one starts with the Tower of Babel, so around minus 2300. And this last one is actually the last spread. And the only point I want to make is how things seem to get so complicated, how time seems to accelerate so much so that there's not even enough space to map it all. So when we get closer, time accelerates, things get fragmented, the world seems to get more complex. So around is an attention to the larger context, from which we can in turn reflect back on yet a larger field of time and draw similarities as well as differences, where we can begin to note what belongs to one time or even what might not belong to that time, that is, what is anachronistic. So anachronistic is that which involves anachronism. Anachronism is the representation of something as existing or occurring at other than its proper time. Anachronism was attested in French in 1625, so 17th century, but the adjective anachronistic was only attested in the 19th century, so at the beginning of the age of historicism. And actually, if we were to apply a historicist reading to a medieval map, we would find them filled with anachronism. But a medieval monk would simply consider it as a representation of time, of messianic time, of the time that remains. And, of course, that time can still contain Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, along with the modern cities of London and Rome. Perhaps this is a hint. Something is anachronistic if we accept the act of cutting up history in distinct periods, but it might belong to the same space and time if for a moment we consider time as the largest force, a time maybe with a capital T that can allow the persistence of one time into another. Let's go back to the professor's dream. So in those notes that Goodchild leaves us to consider the drawing, he also says the following, that to render comparison possible, the two pyramids were put upon the fourth platform. So I'm just showing this table here on the left because it's an earlier chart that Cockerell and Goodchild also worked on for the Royal Academy lectures, and you see it's on a single ground line. But I think what's interesting is that you see that on that earlier drawing, the pyramids are dominated by some medieval and modern buildings. But if you look at the professor's dream, they are the tallest constructions on that drawing. So really Goodchild, is that really to make comparison easier? Should I trust the drawing or should I trust what is written? I will go for the drawing on this one, because in fact, the possibility of comparing heights has already been skewed by time, as each period is raised 30 feet above the other. I'm also inclined to trust the drawing because I think that the pyramids are actually drawn taller than they should be. So it may be that it is their anachronism that is sought, the fact that they can skew the reading of a clean progression. The anachronism skews the reading of the drawing. Though the four platforms might have implied an idea of progression in time, the anachronistic placement of the two pyramids upon the fourth platform, this intended displacement skews the reading of the progression. The pyramids in some ways contain the arrow of time. Their anachronistic placement forces us to see beyond the idea of single slices of time moving up towards a future that might dominate the past. So, just like the calling forth of Cockerell as architect in time gives him a new vocation, so the pulling up of the pyramids gives the drawing a new bent. Now, if we move about this drawing, and if I speak for Cartesian for a moment, moving along X, Y, and Z, if we move along X and thinking that this is a panorama, then we begin at one point and end up where we began. If we move up the drawing, we begin with the lower level with Egyptian constructions and end up with Egyptian constructions. If we move into the depth of the drawing along Z, then we again start with the foreground with Egyptian architecture and end in the background with Egyptian architecture. But what if it's not really Egypt, the starting point, but rather the always changing present? And it doesn't start at zero. There is that space before Egypt begins. And the colors are also darker. This is a one starker contrast that really seems to mark this threshold. And there's not only just this threshold, but there's also the Egyptian pylon, so this entry point where two small figures are currently standing, just about to enter. And there is this line of people currently making their way up to enter. And actually, there is a term used to designate this kind of ceremonial procession, and the name is theory. So theory is going to the temple of history to receive counsel. We stand in the present, on the threshold of history. Perhaps we must also accept to be anachronistic, to move beyond the threshold of the present, go in to experience history, and possibly emerging out back in the present, maybe also anachronistic, like the pyramids. If we now recall Cockerell quoting Schiller in his 1842 first lecture, so on the inevitability of being the child of our own time, it's tempting to return the quote to its context. So I went back to find the quote by Schiller and just continued reading on a little bit. So it is true, the artist is the son of his time, but alas for him, if he's likewise its pupil or even favorite. Let a kind divinity snatch the suckling betimes from his mother's breast, nourish him with the milk of a better age, and let him come to maturity beneath a distant Grecian sky. Then, when he has become a man, let him return, a foreign shape, into his century. He will take his material indeed from the present, but borrow his form from a nobler time, nay, from beyond all time, from the absolute, unchangeable unity of his being. Maybe that's what Cockerell was hinting at. Or he continues, you have given the century this direction towards the good. If, as a teacher or professor, you elevate its thoughts to the necessary and eternal, if, while acting or composing, you transform the necessary and eternal into an object of its impulse. If what is around pointed to the episteme, the anachronistic might point to this impulse, to the actual experience, to the phenomenological dimension, and phenomenon refers to the senses, so what we experience through the sense, perceive. In the dream, Cockerell presents both a reading of the epistemological context as well as a suggestion that one ought to experience it. Like the fragments from which he projects and the ornaments that are put into relations through the movements of the observers, Cockerell's drawing privileges the opening of a space of experience. And so we can consider two dimensions of the relation between architecture and time. How, on the one hand, architecture is conceived against a certain episteme or a certain conception of time, and how, on the other, it is communicated in the time of experience. If we go back to our medieval example, then we see how that is put into play. We can consider how their episteme is communicated in the experience of a church, and sorry, I grabbed fragments from different churches, but this symbolically entering under the depiction of the final judgment, or where the church literally is a threshold between the time and the out of time, or in all the floors, here are the cosmati floor that highlights rituals, or if we think about the labyrinth at Chartres, that literally is an internal pilgrimage, a kind of active player, again, a mediation as one experiences the construction. Or for Cockerell, to build against this really powerful presence of history, well, he used historical ornaments that were not locked to a single meaning, but could signify as index to, so in relation to a situated presence, understood in their context. So there's an opening here. Or if we reflect back on our contemporary world, we can also consider some of our current constructions in relation to this sense of acceleration. And I'm thinking of the dematerialized buildings, such as Blur building by Diller and Scofidio, or building that offer experiences of continuity rather than fixed and distinct states. And the list could be long and could go on. But are buildings conceived to accept an inevitable ephemerality or to participate in the constant change, or do they try to resist it? So moving from messianic conceptions of, from the conceptions of messianic, historicist, or accelerated time, we can appreciate that as conceptions of the episteme change, then the approaches to the communication of a building in time may also shift. We could ask, however, whether the same hinges, fragments, ornaments, anachronistic projections, well, whether these hinges could always operate between these two dimensions, the epistemological and the phenomenological. And we may consider also how much our approaches to architectural representation may accept or participate or challenge or reinforce these conceptions, that is, whether our drawings are neutral or biased. So drawings. A compass dragged across a church floor, a pencil traveling across a sheet, or a pixel position shifting across a screen. Could it be that different representational means implicitly carry their position on a temporal episteme? As Cockerell prepared one of the plates for his publication on Aegina and Bassa. So that's in 1860, 50 years pretty much after he visited this site originally. He made a slight adjustment to a drawing that already rarely appeared in such publications. So it was already uncommon to include a view of the temple in ruin, and also, I mean, sometimes you would have the view as the first drawing as an entry point, but here it's right in the middle of a number of plates that show the reconstructed temple through orthographic views. So already that is interesting, that plate 10 is a plate of the building in ruin. But even more interesting is that when he prepared this place based on a sketch at first made on site in 1811 on the left, he adjusted the perspective slightly. So if you can see on the first plate, he's standing slightly elevated, drawing the scene. But if you superimpose, you realize that he's just allowed us to enter directly into the space of the temple. In short, we can ourselves start to reconstitute the temple from its fragment. He opened up the space for the experience of the observer. What is in a drawing? In another one of his drawings, which I discussed in the last chapter of the book, there's a strange note. The architect's hand is seen here. So Cambridge University Library study for the east front of North Wing, the architect's own hand is seen here. So this drawing is a strange drawing of the east elevation of the North Wing. Remember, that's the only wing that was ever built of the full quadrangle. And here it's represented on its own, which is very rare. Typically, Cockerell still represented it as though the whole project was going to be built. So what did Cockerell mean by this note? Did he simply mean to say, I drew this? Well, he drew many other drawings, but that's the only time, so as far as I'm aware, that he put this note. So did the note draw attention to the fact that he understood the fragmentary conditions of this wing? And actually, if we look at the evolution of the project, I mean, this is the east elevation of the North Wing. It's so secondary to the whole front elevation because it stands right in front of the Senate House, which he quite liked and was happy to let, win the show. But as it became clear that the North Wing was the only fragment that was going to be built, it's as though elements that were developed in other areas of the whole project slowly migrated to that elevation so that maybe it could speak to the whole. Or did he point again to the situated presence? Did the hand, the note, point to the fact that the elevation would never be perceived as shown in the orthographic drawing, and the hand that we see is the hand that is actively still seeking what will be perceived, and I don't know if you see the light sketch above of someone looking up. So tightly contained between this elevation and the Senate House, not too far in front of it, we will look up, as Cockerell's hand currently is, anticipating the movements of perception. So Cockerell's hand is the hand accepting the view from below. To Cockerell's view from below, modernity seems to have responded with the view from above. Hand pointing down at model. Mies, Corbusier's, perhaps taking that place that the fingers of God, the geometer, sometimes held in medieval representations. But as we all know now, this is also a position that is outside of time. What does it say about the time conveyed in some of the modern approaches to representation? So we could follow the demise of the utopian modern dream and the collapse of this universal ideal, along with its progressive era of time, into some of the projects of architects such as Eisenman, where, for example, in House X, the representation points back to its own internal time. It self-references its own idiosyncratic process of creation and transformation. So, no longer the view from above, but the view from within. Or we could consider more recent approaches. Computational representation and design is back to taking the pulse of the world and reacting as well as preempting as much as possible. And it brings us back not to God's finger nor to the architect's hands, whether above, within, or below, but to digits. Digits, the most sensible part of our hands, precise motors of our tangible encounters. Interesting that this should be linked to this new digital world. Antoine Picon, the French architectural historian, looking at digital architecture, insofar as it is characterized by what he refers to as the temporal structure of the internet experience, so a frame-by-frame strategy, or he talks about frozen time. Well, he suggests that much of contemporary digitally conceived projects hinge on a suspension of historical time. So here we are, ending with the suspension of historical time, though we began with an architect in time, or maybe we are at the same place. According to Picon, we are in the middle of a dramatic redefinition of the relation of architecture to time and history. So it seems that definitions and redefinitions of the relation between architecture, time, and history are persisting, always present, always urgent. Charles Robert Cockerell, Architect in Time, Reflections around Anachronistic Drawings, is not a biography as it looks for points of contact. It is not a biography because it collects Cockerell's life around his desire to be architect in time. No less concerned with Cockerell's work, the book does not attempt to cover it, to be on it, but moves around and in between different drawings and different times to reflect on the reciprocal relationship between Cockerell's conception of architecture's epistemological grounding and his approach to architecture's phenomenological life. Taking the fragment as a hinge, considering it in relation to a larger, richer, yet not fully knowable whole, in many ways, this was Cockerell's art all along. As a grand tourist, he pieced together fragments of an order so that this newly formed fragment could be related to a larger building. Plate X spoke to the temporary encounter, his or ours, a moment in time measured against the ruined temple and the possibility of restoration. Likewise, the incomplete projects of Elm St. George's Hall, like the ruined temples encountered during the Grand Tour, represented fragments to be completed, wherein isolated parts had to be understood insofar as these too participated in a larger whole. The presentation drawings produced for the project in Liverpool, as well as the Cambridge University Library, again brought into play the relations of part to whole, laying out fragmented elements that spoke of larger vision. At both ends of the spectrum, the Bassa Capitol and the Professor's Dream, respectively part and whole, hint at the bearing of phenomenological considerations of an architecture to be experienced in time, together with a larger temporal and historical episteme against which architecture is always cast. In all these endeavors, the past is envisioned in relation to an existing whole or a potential whole from the present fragment. There is yet another scenario in which Cockerell's work as an architect called upon the ability to navigate between the fragment and the whole. He made a strange comment about what he considered to be his best work. He said, "All my life I have desired to achieve something grand, but never have succeeded, except once, in the scraper of the north door of St. Paul's, which I put up. I hope you will do me the honor to look at it." Was this a joke? Well, David Watkins, the biographer, architectural historian, thinks so, and maybe he is right. But what if Cockerell was being sincere? What if he is referring again to a larger consideration of his work in time, here happily in the shadow of an architect whose fame already extends beyond a single time, so Christopher Wren? In the course of my research on Cockerell, I visited St. Paul's Cathedral, did Cockerell the honor of looking at the scraper to the right of the main entrance. I have to say, though, that nobody else seemed to notice whether or not their boots were clean. A few years ago, I took a group of students to see Peter Zumthor's Zumweg Chapel and noticed another fairly unnoticeable piece of metal, a steel scraper positioned very simply on the concrete steps leading up to the small church. In a small community, itself humbled by the majestic Alps that extend all around it. Then I wonder, is to notice the scraper and stop to cleanse one's boots a way to extend respect to this community in this larger landscape? And so we are back to the relation between part and whole, between a face and a building, the building in its context, the context in its time, between a 19th century architect's drawing and architectural meaning, between contemporary architecture and its footings. Thank you.